Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail into the wild, salt-sprayed world of one of the most terrifying people ever to make an empire nervous. The Irish pirate queen who spent roughly 40 years being a personal, ongoing headache to the most powerful woman on earth. Not the tidy movie pirate with the eyeliner and the quippy one-liners and the suspiciously clean shirt. I mean the real thing. A woman who commanded fleets, raided coastlines, ran her own private navy, collected tolls from anyone foolish enough to sail past her front door, and eventually got so fed up with English bureaucracy that she sailed all the way to London to complain to the Queen of England directly, in person, like returning a faulty toaster. Her name was Grace O'Malley, though the Irish called her Granuaile, and the English mostly filed her under problems that will not go away. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuine, heartfelt thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. You are the reason we sail these strange historical waters at all, and requests like yours quietly steer this whole ship. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always the middle of the night for someone. The channel is also now drifting around on Spotify if you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, and there's a link in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft ocean-adjacent hum, and get comfortable. Let's pause and wonder for a moment. What does it actually take to run a criminal empire before the invention of the phone, the calendar, or the concept of a weekend? Could you negotiate a truce with a rival warlord in the morning and still get everyone fed by supper? Would you have the nerve to raid a merchant ship, raise several children, and manage a castle full of heavily armed men who all technically report to you? And if the most powerful monarch in Europe demanded you kneel, would you do it, or would you decide that today, actually your knees are fine? Settle in, because the year is 1530. The place is the wind-battered west coast of Ireland, and a baby girl is about to be born who will grow up to terrorize an empire, outlive nearly all her enemies, and refuse, absolutely refuse, to bow to anyone. Long before Grace was born, the O'Malleys had a reputation, and it was not the polite kind. While most Irish lords of the time measured their power in cattle, green fields, and how many cousins they could talk into a fight, the O'Malleys measured theirs in ships. They ruled a jagged stretch of the western coast around Clew Bay, in what is now County Mayo, a place of black cliffs, sudden storms, and roughly 365 islands, give or take a few that only appear at low tide. Their family motto translated to something like powerful by land and sea, which is a bold thing to stitch onto your banner, but the O'Malleys had the receipts. They fished, they traded, they escorted, they occasionally relieved passing vessels of their cargo, and they did it all in an age when most people considered the ocean less a highway and more a large, wet way to die. This was the world Grace was born into. Not a kingdom of thrones and tapestries, but a hard, briny frontier where your worth was decided by whether you could read the weather and outrun a bigger boat. To understand how unusual this was, you have to understand the rest of Gaelic Ireland. Most clans of the period were land creatures through and through. Their wealth walked around on four legs and mooed. Their disputes were settled in muddy fields, and their idea of a bold voyage was crossing a river without falling in. The sea to them was the edge of the map, the place where the reliable world ran out. The O'Malleys looked at that same terrifying grey horizon and saw a front door. They built their entire identity around the water, which is a bit like a family today deciding that everyone else can keep their nice safe office jobs, while the O'Malleys will be over here making a living inside an active volcano. The bay itself did most of the recruiting. Clew Bay is a maze, a scatter of islands and hidden channels and shallow inlets, where a boat that knows the way can vanish, and a boat that does not can end its career on a rock. For a family of skilled sailors, this was less a home and more a fortress with a moat the size of the Atlantic. Larger, heavier ships from elsewhere could chase the O'Malleys right up to the mouth of the bay, and then had to stop, the way a big dog gives up at the edge of the small dog's very specific hole in the fence. Local knowledge was the whole game, and the O'Malleys had generations of it soaked into their bones. They were not simply raiders. Whatever the merchants of Galway muttered into their ledgers, they ran a genuine maritime enterprise. They carried goods for money, guided ships through dangerous water for a fee, fished the rich Atlantic stocks, and traded as far as Spain and Portugal, exchanging hides and fish for wine and salt and whatever else the wider world was selling. The occasional bit of plundering was more of a side hustle than the main business, a flexible add-on service for anyone who declined the polite options first. So when Grace arrived, the ambition was already sitting there waiting for her, sharpened over generations and pointed straight out to sea. She did not invent the family's love of the water, she simply inherited it, absorbed it, and then, in a way no O'Malley before her had quite managed, made the whole of Europe learn the name. The clan owned the sea. Grace was about to rule it. Grace O'Malley came into the world around the year 1530, the daughter of Eochaid Dubhdara O'Malley, a chieftain whose nickname roughly meant Black Oak, which tells you most of what you need to know about the man's personality. Her father was lord of the seafaring O'Malleys, a chieftain of ships and salt water, and her mother came from good clan stock as well. By the standards of the day, Grace was well born, which in 16th century Gaelic Ireland meant she had a stone tower to sleep in, servants to boss around, and a reasonable expectation of not starving. What it did not mean, at least not for a girl, was a future spent anywhere near the family business. Girls of her rank were raised for one destiny, and it was marriage, alliances, and producing the next generation of chieftains. Nobody looked at the small, stubborn O'Malley girl and thought, there goes a future admiral. Nobody except, apparently, Grace. The tower she grew up in was no cosy cottage, but it was a long way from comfortable either. Picture cold stone walls that sweated in the damp, narrow windows built for shooting arrows rather than admiring views, and a hearth fire that everyone crowded around like it owed them money. This was luxury by the measure of the age, the medieval version of a good postcode. Grace had a roof that mostly kept the rain out and food that mostly turned up, which put her comfortably ahead of the peasants scratching a living in the fields below. Being well born in that world was less about silk cushions and more about simply having a solid stone box between you and a very unforgiving Atlantic. Her father, Black Oak, was the kind of man who filled a room and then complained it was too small. As chieftain, he commanded the O'Malley fleet, ran the trade, collected what was owed, and generally embodied the family motto with his whole chest. Grace grew up watching him. She watched the ships come and go, watched the crews respect him, watched deals struck and disputes settled, and absorbed the entire operation the way a child soaks up a language without anyone sitting her down to teach it. It is one thing to be told about power, it is another to grow up marinating in it, and Grace marinated thoroughly. There was, of course, the small matter of her being a girl, which the era treated as a permanent disqualification from anything interesting. A daughter of a chieftain was a diplomatic asset, a future bride to be traded to a neighbouring clan to seal an alliance. Her value was measured in the connections her marriage could buy, not in anything she might personally do. It was a bit like being raised as a very expensive gift card, valuable only for what you could be redeemed against later. Everyone around Grace understood this arrangement perfectly. Everyone, it seems, except Grace, who kept looking at the ships instead of at the altar. Because down in the harbour, something far more compelling than needlework was happening every single day. Sails were rising, men were shouting, cargo was moving, and the whole thrilling machinery of a life at sea was unfolding within sight of her tower window. To a spirited child with no interest in the destiny assigned to her, the choice was not really a choice at all. On one side sat the quiet, tidy, entirely predictable future of a well-married daughter. On the other side sat the ocean, loud and dangerous and gloriously indifferent to what girls were supposed to want. Grace looked at both, made her decision early, and never seriously revised it. The most famous story about Grace's childhood may or may not be true, which is the case for roughly half the good stories about her, but it is too perfect to skip. As a girl, she reportedly begged to sail with her father on a trading voyage, possibly to Spain, and was told absolutely not. The reason given was that her long hair would catch in the ropes and rigging, and generally get in the way of the serious sailing men. So Grace, being Grace, marched off and hacked most of it off herself, returning with a haircut that horrified the adults and solved her problem entirely. The clan started calling her Green Mahol, which means something close to bald Grace or cropped Grace, and the name stuck for the rest of her life. Whether the haircut happened exactly like that hardly matters. The point of the story is the message delivered at roughly age 10. Tell Grace O'Malley she cannot do something, and she will remove the obstacle up to and including her own hair. Consider the scene from the adult's point of view. A small girl approaches the great chieftain, requests a spot on a working voyage, and receives a firm and reasonable no. The men probably assumed that was the end of it. Children ask for impossible things constantly, and the standard response is to say no and wait for them to be distracted by something shiny. What none of them accounted for was that Grace treated no not as a full stop, but as an opening bid. The hair excuse was meant to close the conversation. Grace heard it as a to-do list, and the beauty of her response is how brutally literal it was. She was not told she was too young, or too small, or too female, all of which would have been harder to argue with. She was told specifically that her hair was the problem, so she addressed the specific problem with a specific solution and a nearby blade. It is the kind of maneuver that leaves the other side with nowhere to stand. Imagine being told you cannot enter a building because of the coffee cup in your hand, and calmly dropping the cup on the floor while maintaining eye contact. The objection has been resolved. What now? The nickname is the real tell. In a culture that loved a good descriptive nickname, they didn't call her Grace the Disobedient or Grace the Foolish. They called her Cropped Grace, and the name followed her into adulthood, onto her ships, into legend. It became less a mockery than a kind of badge, a permanent reminder of the day a 10-year-old refused to accept the answer she'd been given. Every time someone said Graina Maol, they were, whether they meant to or not, retelling the story of the girl who outstubborned her elders with a haircut. Historians will rightly point out that we have no contemporary receipt for this event, no witness statement, no lock of hair preserved in a drawer. It may have grown in the telling, or been invented whole to explain a name whose origin was actually more boring. That is fine. Some stories earn their place not because they are provably true, but because they are perfectly, unmistakably in character. Everything Grace did later, every deal, every siege, every refusal to bow, rhymes with this small early act of defiance. The haircut is the whole woman in miniature, handed to us at age 10, scissors in hand, already deciding that the rules were negotiable and the ocean was hers. Once Grace talked her way onto the ships, she did not simply sit prettily on deck admiring the view. She learned. She learned how to read the sky and the swell, how to feel a shift in the wind before it arrived, how to navigate a coastline studded with rocks that had eaten better sailors than most. She learned the galleys, long low vessels rowed by dozens of men and rigged with a single sail, perfect for darting in and out of shallow bays where heavier English ships could not follow. She learned the trade routes, the tides, the tempers of the men, and the 1,000 small decisions that separate a captain from a corpse. Imagine an internship where the performance review is conducted by the North Atlantic in February and failure means drowning. That was Grace's education. By the time she was grown, she knew those waters the way you know the walk from your bed to your fridge in the dark, and she was about to put that knowledge to a use nobody had planned for. Start with the sky, because at sea, the sky is the whole newspaper, weather section, and evening news rolled into one. There were no forecasts, no satellites, no cheerful person pointing at a map. There was only the colour of the clouds, the feel of the air, the behaviour of the birds, and the memory of every storm that had ever tried to kill you. A good sailor read all of it constantly and instinctively. Grace learned to notice the small warnings, the ones that meant get to shelter now rather than in an hour, because in an hour there might not be a you left to shelter. Then there were the galleys themselves, and this is where local knowledge became a weapon. These were not lumbering treasure ships. They were sleek, oar-driven craft that sat low in the water and could go where deep-keeled vessels simply could not, slipping through shallow channels and hiding among the islands. In the hands of someone who knew Clew Bay's every hidden rock and secret passage, a galley was less a boat and more a magic trick. Grace learned to make ships disappear into a coastline that looked, to any outsider, like a solid wall of danger. The men were their own kind of ocean, and arguably the trickier one to navigate. A ship's crew in that era was a floating collection of hard, dangerous, superstitious individuals who respected exactly two things, competence and nerve, and who had precisely zero patience for a passenger playing at sailor. Grace could not command by title, because she had none that mattered out on the water. She had to earn it the slow way, by being useful, by being right, by not flinching when flinching was the natural response. Every voyage was a quiet audition in front of the most sceptical audience imaginable, and underneath all of it ran the simplest, harshest teacher of all, consequence. On land, a mistake is embarrassing. At sea, a mistake is often fatal, and not just for you. Misjudge a tide, misread a squall, take the wrong channel, and the ocean settles the account immediately and without appeal. This is a spectacularly effective way to learn, if you survive the curriculum. Grace survived it, lesson after lesson, until the knowledge stopped being something she thought about and became something she simply was. By the time she reached adulthood, Grace was not a chieftain's daughter who happened to like boats. She was a genuine sailor, forged by the most unforgiving instructor on earth, carrying in her head a map of the western coast more detailed than anything on paper. The education nobody wanted to give her was complete, and it had made her extraordinary. All she needed now was the chance to use it. Around the year 1546, when Grace was roughly 16, the family did what families like hers always did. They married her off. The lucky groom was Dónal Chogaid ó Flaithberthe, whose colourful nickname translated to Dónal of the Battle, which is a promising sign for a peaceful domestic life. He belonged to the O'Flaherty clan, powerful lords of the region to the south, and the marriage was a straightforward political alliance, the 16th century equivalent of merging two family businesses and hoping the in-laws behave at the reception. Grace moved into O'Flaherty territory as the wife of a chieftain's heir, which sounds like a comfortable landing. But Grace had not spent her childhood learning to command a galley in order to become quiet furniture in someone else's castle. Donnell of the Battle had married a woman who already knew more about ships, trade and leadership than most of the men around him, and it would not take long for everyone, including Donnell, to notice. Marriage in this world had almost nothing to do with the feelings of the two people involved, which is worth sitting with for a moment. A daughter of a chieftain was a diplomatic instrument, and her wedding was a treaty with a party at the end of it. The point was to bind two clans together, to turn potential enemies into reluctant relatives, to secure trade or peace or muscle. Love, if it happened, was a pleasant surprise, like finding money in an old coat. Grace was 16, and her opinion on the matter was solicited about as often as the weather asks permission to rain. Donnell, for his part, was exactly the sort of man the age produced in bulk. A fighting chieftain's heir with a nickname built around combat, he was hot-tempered, aggressive, and enthusiastically committed to the regional hobby of feuding with the neighbours. The O'Flahertys were a serious power in their own right, so from the family's point of view the match was excellent. From Grace's point of view, she had traded one stone tower for another, and gained a husband whose main interest appeared to be starting fights. It was, at best, a lateral move. But here is where the arrangement backfired in a way nobody anticipated. The families had treated Grace as a piece to be placed on the board, a valuable but passive asset. They had entirely failed to account for the possibility that the asset had spent years learning to run ships and command men and read the sea, and had absolutely no intention of switching that off just because she now had a wedding ring and a new address. You cannot raise a hawk, hand it to someone as a decorative gift and expect it to behave like a cushion. So Grace arrived in O'Flaherty country carrying skills that her new household had no idea what to do with. Donnell was off doing what Donnell did, which was fighting, and that left gaps, openings and problems that needed solving. Grace, who had never in her life waited politely to be asked, began to fill them. She understood the sea better than the men around her. She understood trade, leadership, the practical business of keeping ships and money moving. The quiet, ornamental role she had been assigned simply could not contain what she actually was. The marriage, in the end, was less a cage than a launch pad, though nobody planned it that way. It gave Grace a new theatre, a new set of ships and men and problems, and a husband too busy brawling to notice his wife quietly becoming the most capable person in the region. The families had wanted an alliance and a broodmare. What they got, without realising it yet, was the beginning of a legend, wearing a wedding dress and eyeing the harbour. Grace and Donnell had 3 children together, Owen, Murrow, and a daughter named Margaret, and Grace managed the small miracle of raising them in a region that treated open warfare as a normal seasonal activity. The O'Flahertys feuded with neighbours, feuded with rivals, and occasionally feuded with the city of Galway, whose merchants regarded the whole clan as a maritime nuisance. Motherhood here was not a matter of soft lullabies and tidy nurseries. It was raising children in a stone tower, while their father rode off to another skirmish, keeping a household running and somehow staying involved in the far more interesting world of the sea. Modern parents who feel heroic for juggling a job and a school run might spare a thought for Grace, who juggled toddlers, tides, and the constant low hum of impending violence, and never once got to complain about it on the internet. Consider first the sheer physical danger of simply having a baby in that era. There were no hospitals, no anaesthesia, no clean instruments, no doctors as we would recognise them, just a midwife, some prayers, and grim odds. Childbirth was one of the leading killers of women, a private battlefield every bit as deadly as the ones the men rode off to. Grace did it 3 times in this marriage alone and lived, which by the standards of the age was already a notable achievement before she'd done anything else with her day. Then there was the home itself, which was less a nursery and more a defensive position. Raising children in a fortified tower meant a childhood of cold stone, narrow windows, and the ever-present awareness that violence could arrive without much notice. There was no fencing off the sharp corners of this world. The corners were the world. Children grew up understanding raids, feuds, and the location of the safest room in the tower, the way modern children understand where the snacks are kept. Grace's job was not to shield them from all of it, which was impossible, but to keep the household functioning steadily inside the chaos. And functioning it was, because a chieftain's household was a genuine operation. Someone had to manage the food, the servants, the stores, the endless logistics of keeping dozens of people fed and clothed and pointed in useful directions. With Donal frequently absent, off battling whoever was on the schedule that month, a great deal of that management fell to Grace. She was, in effect, running a small institution, part home, part warehouse, part command post, while also being the mother of small children. The multitasking involved would make a modern chief executive lie down in a dark room. But the truly telling part is that Grace never fully surrendered the sea, even in these years. Many women in her position would have been swallowed whole by the demands of children and household, and no one would have blamed them. Grace instead kept one hand on the ropes throughout. She stayed connected to the trade, to the ships, to the maritime world she had loved since childhood, refusing to let motherhood erase the sailor. The two lives ran side by side, each somehow making room for the other, held together by a woman with an apparently bottomless supply of energy and nerve. It is easy, retelling the dramatic later chapters, to skip lightly over this stretch as a quiet interlude before the real adventures. That would be a mistake. These were the years Grace proved she could carry an impossible load without dropping it, could hold a household and a fleet and 3 children in the same 2 hands, could be a mother and a leader at once because the world gave her no option to pick just one. The Pirate Queen was being forged here too, not in battle, but in the relentless, unglamorous work of keeping everything alive at the same time. Somewhere in the O'Flaherty years, a quiet transfer of authority took place. On paper, Donal was the fighting man, the chieftain's son, the one whose name went in the records. In practice, Grace began taking the O'Malley ships and instincts she'd grown up with and applying them to O'Flaherty business, and the men noticed who actually knew what she was doing. She led at sea, she organised, she made decisions that stuck. In a culture where formal power belonged firmly to men, Grace built the other kind of power, the kind that comes from competence so obvious that people simply start following you without anyone voting on it. It was an early preview of the rest of her life. Grace did not wait to be handed authority, because in her world it would never have been handed to a woman at all. She just quietly did the job better than the men who held the title, and let reality catch up. There is a useful distinction here between the two kinds of power, and Grace understood it instinctively long before anyone gave it a name. There is official power, the sort written in law and custom, the sort that comes with a title and a seat at the table. And there is real power, the sort that exists because when a particular person speaks, things actually happen. The two are supposed to line up neatly. In practice, they drift apart constantly, and the gap between them is where clever people who have been denied the title quietly build their empires. Grace lived in that gap and furnished it beautifully. Donal held the official power, and he was welcome to it. He had the name, the lineage, the recognised right to command, all the trappings the system reserved for men like him. What he did not reliably have was the steady judgment, the maritime skill, or the temperament to run a complex operation, on account of being Donal of the battle, a man whose solution to most problems involved a weapon. When you are frequently away fighting and not especially gifted at the patient work of organisation, a vacuum forms. Grace, ever practical, did not lecture anyone about the vacuum. She simply filled it. And the men followed her. which is the part that should stop you in your tracks. These were not soft courtiers accustomed to obeying whoever was fashionable. These were rough seafaring O'Flaherty men in a fiercely male world, and they took direction from a woman not because law required it, not because custom encouraged it, but because she was clearly, repeatedly, the person most likely to keep them alive and profitable. Loyalty like that cannot be ordered into existence. It is the residue of being right so many times that doubting you starts to feel foolish. Picture the awkward mathematics of it from the men's side. On one hand, everything they had been raised to believe told them leadership was a male affair. On the other hand, standing in front of them was someone who could out-navigate, out-plan, and out-decide anyone else in the room, and who happened to be a woman. Faced with the choice between their assumptions and their survival, sensible men chose survival. Reality, as it usually does, won the argument, and the assumptions quietly rearranged themselves around it. This is the pattern that would define Grace's entire career, established here in miniature during a marriage that history barely bothers to detail. She would never be handed power, not once, not by anyone, because the world she lived in did not hand power to women. So she took a different route entirely. She became so undeniably good at the actual work that authority accumulated around her, whether the rules allowed it or not, like water finding its level. The title stayed with the men. The following came to Grace. And she had figured out, before she was even a widow, that the following was the part that mattered. One of Grace's legendary moments came at a stronghold on Lough Corrib known as the Hen's Castle, where, according to the stories, she found herself besieged by enemies while low on men and options. The tale goes that when the attackers tried to storm the walls, Grace ordered the lead roof stripped, melted down and poured, still scalding, onto the men climbing below, which is a striking way to say the welcome is over. With supplies running out, she's said to have sent someone to light a signal fire to summon help, holding the castle by sheer nerve until reinforcements arrived. Like many Grace stories, the details have been polished by centuries of retelling, and historians raise a careful eyebrow at the specifics. But the reputation it captures is real. Grace under siege did not panic, did not fold, and did not wait to be rescued. She improvised with whatever was on hand, even if what was on hand was the roof. Let us appreciate the sheer horror of the situation first. A siege was slow, grinding terror, not a quick clash. The enemy sat outside your walls, cut off your supplies, and waited for hunger, thirst, or despair to do their work for them. Time was the weapon, and time was on their side. Inside, every day meant less food, fewer options, and the steadily rising math of doom. Most people in that position spent their energy on prayer and rationing. Grace apparently spent hers on architecture and chemistry, because the roof detail is genuinely inspired in a grim sort of way. Lead was used in roofing, and lead melts at a temperature a determined defender can achieve. So faced with men climbing the walls, Grace looked up, considered the material sitting above her head, and decided it would serve better as a weapon than as weatherproofing. It is the kind of thinking that separates survivors from statistics, the ability to look at your own falling apart situation and see, instead of a list of things you lack, an inventory of things you can use. The house is your fortress right up until the moment the house becomes your ammunition. Imagine being one of the attackers in that moment. You have done everything correctly. You have surrounded a weakened enemy, cut off their help, and started climbing walls held by a force too small to stop you. Victory is essentially a formality. And then the roof itself comes down on you in liquid form, and your entire confident afternoon rearranges itself around the concept of molten metal. Nothing in the standard siege playbook prepares you for the defenders weaponizing the building. It is the tactical equivalent of winning an argument and then being hit with the table. The signal fire is the other half of the story, and it reveals the same mind at work from a different angle. Pouring the roof on people buys time. It does not by itself win. Grace understood that improvisation had to be paired with a plan for actual rescue, so she arranged to summon help, holding the line not out of blind stubbornness, but because she knew reinforcements were coming and simply had to survive until they did. That is the difference between panic and command. Panic reacts. Command buys time on purpose, toward a goal, with the endgame already in mind. Whether every detail happened precisely as the legend claims, we cannot prove, and honest history admits as much. But stories cling to people for reasons, and this one clings to Grace because it fits her exactly. A cornered leader, outnumbered and low on supplies, refusing to break, turning her own shelter into a weapon and her own nerve into a strategy, holding on through sheer refusal until help arrived. True in every detail or merely true in spirit, the Hen's Castle tells you precisely who Grace O'Malley was when the walls were closing in. She was the last person in the room you wanted to underestimate. Donnell of the Battle eventually died, as men with that nickname tend to, violently, and Grace found herself a widow. Under the customs of the time, a widow's position could be precarious, but Grace was not the sort to sit gracefully in mourning and await instructions. She gathered a following of loyal men, reportedly a couple of hundred of them, and returned to her own people's territory around Clew Bay, setting herself up as a leader in her own right. This was the turning point. No longer defined as somebody's wife or somebody's daughter, Grace became simply Grace, commander of ships and men, mistress of her own affairs. She based herself among the islands she knew best, took full advantage of the family's seafaring tradition, and turned grief into a business plan. The girl who cut her hair to get on a boat now owned the boats, and she intended to use them. Widowhood, for most women of the era, was a slide into dependence and vulnerability. A woman's status was borrowed from the man she was attached to, and when he died, the loan was called in. She might be shuffled back to her birth family, pressured into another marriage, or quietly stripped of whatever she had held, her position dissolving the moment her husband stopped breathing. It was one of the crueler mechanisms of a world that treated women as extensions of men. Remove the man, and the woman was expected to fade politely into the background. Grace declined the background. The crucial fact is that a following of men, several hundred of them by report, chose to attach themselves to her, personally, not to a husband or a father, but to Grace herself. This was not a widow being tolerated. This was a leader being followed. Those men had options, and they picked the woman, because the years of quiet competence during her marriage had built exactly the kind of reputation that makes hard men decide their best future lies wherever she points. The authority she had accumulated in the gap between title and reality now became something she could stand on entirely alone. And notice where she went. She did not linger in O'Flaherty country as a diminished dowager. She went home, back to Clew Bay, back to the O'Malley Islands, back to the specific patch of ocean whose every rock and channel and tide she had memorized as a child. This was not sentiment, or not only sentiment, it was strategy. She returned to the one place on earth where her knowledge was an unbeatable advantage, where the family's seafaring tradition gave her ships and skilled men and legitimacy, where she could operate from strength instead of on someone else's turf. Grace understood that power has a geography, and hers was drawn in salt water. Then comes the phrase that ought to be carved somewhere, because it captures the whole extraordinary pivot. Grace turned grief into a business plan. Whatever private sorrow she felt at Donnell's death, and we cannot know that she felt much, she did not let it become paralysis. She converted a moment that was supposed to weaken her into the foundation of her independence. The death of her husband, which the customs of the time intended as the end of her standing, she reinterpreted as the start of her actual career. It was the ultimate refusal to play the assigned part. From this point forward, Grace answered to no one, not a father, not a husband, not the expectations of a society that had never planned for a woman like her. She had her ships, her men, her islands, and her hard-won mastery of the sea, and she assembled them into something the world had not seen. The long apprenticeship was over. The years of building quiet power behind other people's titles were done. Standing on the deck of her own galley in her own waters at the head of her own men, Grace O'Malley finally became the thing she had been aiming at since she was 10 years old, with a knife in her hand and a fresh haircut. She became the one in charge. Here is where the word pirate earns its keep. Grace positioned herself and her fleet along one of the busiest trading approaches to the west of Ireland, and established what can only be described as an aggressive customs service. Ships passing through waters she considered hers were invited strongly to pay for the privilege, pay the toll, and Grace might even provide safe passage and pilotage through the treacherous coast, which was arguably a fair deal. Refuse, and the encounter tended to become less of a negotiation and more of a redistribution of your cargo. It was piracy, yes, but it was piracy with a system, a logic, and a certain grim professionalism. Think of it as the world's least optional subscription service. Grace was not lurking in the shadows waiting to plunder. She was running a coastline like a business, and the merchants of Galway, who complained about her bitterly and constantly, understood exactly who was in charge of the water. The genius of the operation lay in its location. Grace's territory sat astride the sea lanes that ships had to use to reach the ports of the west, and those same waters were a nightmare of hidden rocks, sudden weather, and shallow channels that could gut an unwary hull. She controlled a choke point, and she controlled the knowledge required to pass through it safely. That combination is the dream of anyone in the tolling business, ancient or modern. You cannot go around, you cannot go through without risk, and the person who owns the only safe path sets the price. Grace had effectively built a booth across the sea and hung out a sign, and it is worth being fair about the deal on offer because Grace was not simply robbing people, or not only. Pay the fee, and she genuinely could deliver value in return, safe passage through waters that had drowned countless sailors, guidance from people who knew every rock by name. In that light, the toll starts to look less like extortion and more like a rough insurance policy with a very persuasive salesperson. You paid Grace, and Grace made sure the sea did not kill you, which was a service the sea was otherwise extremely eager to provide for free. The alternative, of course, was where the pirate reputation came from. Decline to pay, and the polite framework fell away to reveal the harder reality underneath. Grace's fast galleys, crewed by hard men who knew the waters intimately, were more than capable of catching a stubborn merchant vessel and relieving it of whatever made the trip worthwhile. The choice she offered was, in truth, barely a choice at all. Pay a manageable fee and pass in safety, or refuse and lose a great deal more, possibly including your cargo, your dignity, and your afternoon. Framed that way, most captains discovered they were happy to contribute. What makes it fascinating rather than merely criminal is the professionalism of the thing. This was not chaotic, opportunistic raiding, a sudden pounce whenever a target wandered by. It was a system, run with logic and consistency, a standing operation with rules and expectations that everyone in the region came to understand. Grace was less a lurking bandit, and more a very heavily armed harbour authority who had never been officially appointed. The waters had a management now, and the management had a fleet, and the fleet had opinions about who owed what. The merchants of Galway, that prosperous port city, hated the arrangement with a passion, and their complaints echo through the records like a long grinding gripe. But the very bitterness of those complaints is the proof of Grace's success. You do not complain constantly and desperately about someone powerless. You complain like that about someone who is genuinely, unavoidably in control of something you need and who is making you pay for it. Every furious letter and outraged petition was, underneath the anger, an admission. Grace O'Malley owned the water, and everyone who wished to use it knew precisely whose permission and whose price stood between them and the open sea. Grace commanded fast galleys crewed by hard men who lived and fought at sea, and by every surviving account they followed her without hesitation. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In 16th century Ireland, a crowd of armed, dangerous seafaring men took orders from a woman, sailed where she pointed, fought when she said fight, and did not, as far as history records, spend much time questioning it. That kind of loyalty is not decreed. It is earned through years of being right, being fearless, and sharing the danger rather than watching from the shore. Grace was not a distant figurehead. She sailed with her fleet, she led from the front, and she reportedly understood every rope and reef better than the men around her. Leadership, it turns out, translates across gender and centuries with surprising ease when the person in charge actually knows what they're doing. Start with the ships, because the choice of vessel tells you how Grace liked to work. The galley was long, low, and driven by oars as well as sail, which meant it did not have to wait politely for the wind to cooperate. It could move in a dead calm, dart through narrow channels, and hug a coastline that would tear the bottom out of a heavier ship. In the maze of Clew Bay, this was everything. Grace's fleet could strike, turn, and vanish into the islands while a pursuing vessel was still working out where the safe water was. She had chosen tools that turned her local knowledge into raw speed. The crews were the other half of the machine, and they were not gentle men. Life at sea in that age selected hard-weathered, superstitious individuals who had survived things that would end most people, and who respected almost nothing on principle. Getting men like that to follow anyone was difficult. Getting them to follow a woman in a culture that reserved command for men should by every expectation have been impossible. Yet the accounts are consistent. They followed Grace, sailed where she sent them, and fought when she gave the word, without the mutinies and grumbling that plagued lesser captains. The reason is not mysterious once you look at how she led. Grace did not command from a comfortable distance, issuing orders and awaiting results from somewhere safe and dry. She sailed with her fleet. She was there in the danger, on the deck in the weather, sharing every risk she asked her men to take. There is no faster way to earn the loyalty of dangerous people than to stand beside them when things go wrong, and no faster way to lose it than to send them into danger you would not enter yourself. Grace, by every report, was always in the danger with them, and underneath the courage sat pure, undeniable competence. She reportedly knew the ropes and the reefs better than the men she commanded, which matters enormously among professionals. Sailors do not respect a title. They respect the person who can read the water, call the weather, and make the decision that keeps everyone breathing. When the captain is also the most skilled sailor aboard, obedience stops being a matter of custom and becomes a matter of common sense. You follow Grace because Grace is right, and being right at sea is the difference between a good story later and a watery grave now. So the loyalty of her crews was not some romantic exception to the rules of her age. It was the perfectly logical result of a leader who was braver, more skilled, and more present than anyone else on the water. Strip away the assumptions about who is supposed to command, and what remains is a simple truth that any sailor could grasp instantly. The best person to follow is the one most likely to bring you home, and on Grace's ships, that person was Grace. Around the year 1566, Grace married again, and this time the choice looks a great deal like strategy, wearing the costume of romance. The groom was Risteard Aniren Bork, known as Iron Richard, a chieftain whose lands included a snug, defensible stronghold on Clew Bay called Rockfleet Castle. Grace, ever the practical tactician, appears to have understood that marrying Richard came with a very desirable piece of real estate attached, a tower perfectly placed to guard her waters and shelter her ships. Whether she loved Iron Richard, tolerated Iron Richard, or simply regarded him as the man who came with the castle, history leaves delightfully open. What is clear is that Grace approached this marriage the way she approached everything else, with a plan, an eye on the map, and a firm sense of what she actually wanted out of the arrangement. The first marriage, remember, had been arranged for her. She was 16, the pieces were moved by her family and her preferences were not consulted. This second marriage was entirely different in one crucial respect. Grace was now an independent power, a widow with her own fleet and her own following, answerable to no father arranging her future, which means that whatever this marriage was, it was her decision, made for her reasons, on her terms. That single change transforms the whole picture. The first time she was a piece on the board, the second time she was one of the players. And when a strategist chooses a spouse, you should look at what the spouse comes with. What Iron Richard came with was Rockfleet Castle, and Rockfleet Castle was not just any tower. It sat on Clew Bay in a position that let it watch over the water Grace already dominated, a snug and defensible strongpoint ideally placed to shelter ships and command the approaches. For a woman whose entire power rested on controlling that bay, a fortress like Rockfleet was not a pleasant bonus. It was the missing piece, the perfect base of operations, the difference between ruling the water and truly owning it. So the romantic reading of this marriage is, let us say, generously optimistic. It is entirely possible Grace felt genuine affection for Iron Richard, and the record is too thin to rule it out. But it is at least as likely that Grace looked at a chieftain with a strategically vital castle and did the same cold, clear calculation she applied to everything else. A tower that controlled her bay was worth marrying for, and if a husband happened to be attached to the deed, that was a manageable complication. It is the sort of clear-eyed practicality that would be called ruthless in a man, and was probably called worse in a woman. There is something almost comic in the mismatch between the era's expectations and Grace's approach. Marriage was supposed to be the moment a woman's independence ended, when she folded herself into her husband's household and life. Grace instead used marriage as an acquisition strategy, a way to extend her own power and add the fortress her operation needed. She flipped the entire institution on its head, treating a wedding not as a surrender of autonomy, but as a tool for increasing it. Iron Richard may have thought he was gaining a wife. He was, in a very real sense, being recruited into Grace's plans. Whether love, convenience, or pure strategy drove the match, the outcome speaks for itself. Grace got Rockfleet, the castle that would anchor her power for the rest of her life, and eventually become the place she died. She got a stronghold on her own bay, a shelter for her fleet, and a commanding position over the waters that made her formidable. The marriage, whatever its emotional content, delivered exactly what a good strategic move should, and knowing Grace, exactly what she had intended when she said yes. The best story about the second marriage, told and retold for centuries, claims that Grace married Iron Richard under Irish law for a trial period of 1 year, after which either party could end it. According to legend, when the year was up, Grace installed herself and her men firmly inside Rockfleet Castle, and when Richard came home, she called down from the walls the medieval equivalent of "you are dismissed," keeping the castle and, in a manner of speaking, the marriage on her own terms. Historians treat the tale with caution, since the neat little story has clearly been sharpened over time. But the couple did stay connected, had a son, and Grace unquestionably ended up controlling Rockfleet. Whether or not she truly locked her husband out of his own house with a single sentence, the story survives because it feels exactly like something Grace O'Malley would do, and nobody has ever been able to argue otherwise. To appreciate the tale, you have to understand that Gaelic Ireland did have its own marriage customs, distinct from the rigid church-bound arrangements elsewhere in Europe, and they allowed for forms of trial marriage and relatively straightforward separation. So the legend is not pure fantasy. It is built on a real foundation, the genuine flexibility of Irish law, which gave a woman like Grace more room to manoeuvre than she would have had almost anywhere else in Christendom. The story exaggerates, certainly, but it grows from soil that could actually support it. Now picture the scene the legend paints, because it is delicious. The trial year ends. Grace, having quietly moved herself and her loyal men into Rockfleet during the term of the marriage, is now in physical possession of the castle. Iron Richard returns home, presumably expecting to continue being married and continue owning his own tower, and finds the door held against him. Grace calls down the famous line, ending the marriage and keeping the fortress in the same breath. It is a checkmate delivered from a battlement, the perfect fusion of romance and real estate, and it treats a husband roughly the way a chess player treats a captured pawn. The manoeuvre, if it happened, was breathtakingly clever. She would have used the trial period not as a genuine test of the relationship, but as a window of opportunity, taking possession of the strategic prize while the marriage was still technically in force, then simply declining to renew once the prize was secure. The castle was always the point. The marriage was the mechanism for acquiring it. Grace in this telling extracted exactly what she wanted from the arrangement, and then closed the account with a single well-chosen sentence shouted from a height. Here is the wrinkle that keeps historians honest, though. The neat story does not quite match the messier facts. Grace and Iron Richard stayed connected afterward, had a son together, and their relationship clearly did not end in a clean slam of the door and never speak again. So the legend, satisfying as it is, has plainly been tidied and sharpened by generations of storytellers who preferred the crisp version to the complicated real one. The truth was almost certainly more tangled, more ongoing, and less like a perfect one-line victory. And yet the story endures, which tells you something important about how legends work. A tale attaches itself to a person when it captures a truth about them that the mere facts do not quite deliver. Nobody kept retelling this story about, say, a quiet farmer, because it would not fit. It stuck to Grace because everyone who heard it thought, yes, of course, that is exactly the kind of thing she would do. The legend may not be accurate history, but it is accurate character. It is the crowd's honest verdict on who Grace was, wrapped in a story too good to let the facts spoil. Grace and Iron Richard had a son, Tibbot, who earned the nickname Tibbot na Long, meaning Theobald of the ships, because he was said to have been born at sea aboard one of his mother's galleys. The legend does not stop there. The very next day, so the story goes, the ship was attacked by corsairs, and when Grace's men faltered, the newly delivered mother rose from her berth, seized a weapon, and stormed onto the deck to rally the defence, roughly 24 hours after giving birth. Any parent who has felt heroic for leaving the house a week after a new baby may now feel appropriately humbled. Once again, the tale is impossible to fully verify, and the details have surely grown in the telling, but it captures the essential, exhausting truth about Grace. There was no situation, not even childbirth in the middle of the ocean, that she considered a valid excuse to stop working. Consider first the plain fact that Grace was aboard a working galley while heavily pregnant, which already tells you something about her relationship with the concept of rest. A woman in the final stretch of pregnancy in that era was expected, sensibly, to stay somewhere safe and stationary. Grace was instead out on the open water, on one of her own ships, doing her own business, apparently right up to the moment the baby decided to arrive. The child's very nickname, Theobald of the Ships, is a permanent record of the fact that his mother simply did not stop being a sea captain in order to have him. Then comes the part that strains belief and yet fits Grace perfectly. The day after giving birth, the ship is set upon by corsairs, North African raiders who prowled these waters, and the fight goes badly enough that Grace's men begin to waver. And Grace, one day removed from childbirth, gets up. She rises from where she's recovering, takes up a weapon, and comes out onto the deck to steady her crew and turn the fight, when by every reasonable standard she should be flat on her back and untouchable. It is the single most on-brand moment in a life full of them. The physical reality of this deserves a pause, because we have sanded down what childbirth meant in a world without medicine. It was dangerous, exhausting, and often left women depleted for weeks. To rise the very next day, let alone to rise and go fight, would have taken a reserve of toughness that is genuinely hard to imagine. The story asks us to believe in a woman so relentless that not even the ordeal of delivering a child could keep her below decks when her men needed her. And the remarkable thing is that, knowing the rest of Grace's life, we more or less do believe it. The image also captures the impossible double role she carried, mother and commander at the exact same instant, quite literally. Most people get to be one thing at a time. Grace in this story is nursing a newborn and repelling boarders on consecutive days, the two halves of her life crashing together on a single deck. There was no clean line for her between the domestic and the dangerous, between being a parent and being a warlord. It was all one life, lived at full speed, with no setting for pause. Whether the Corsair attack unfolded precisely as the legend says, we cannot confirm, and the honest answer is that it has certainly been polished by centuries of admiring retelling. But strip away the possible exaggeration, and the core remains solid and revealing. Grace gave birth at sea, on her own ship, in the middle of her own working life, because that working life did not have an off switch. The legend simply takes that documented toughness and pushes it to its logical, dramatic extreme. It is a tall tale, perhaps, but it is a tall tale built on a foundation of a woman who really did treat impossible as a suggestion. By her prime, Grace had made the family motto her personal reality. She was powerful by land, holding castles and commanding loyalty across the region, and powerful by sea, ruling her waters with a fleet that could appear out of a fog bank and ruin your entire quarter. Her name travelled far beyond Clew Bay, spoken with respect by allies, with resentment by rivals, and with a certain weary dread by the English officials trying to bring order to a corner of Ireland that stubbornly refused to be ordered. She was that rarest of things in her age, a woman whose reputation was built entirely on what she could do rather than whom she'd married. Merchants adjusted their routes around her. Chieftains weighed her as a factor in their plans, and somewhere across the sea, a much larger power was beginning to take notice of the woman who treated the Atlantic like her private drive. The old O'Malley motto, powerful by land and sea, had been a family boast for generations, the kind of grand claim clans like to stitch onto banners. In Grace's hands, it stopped being a boast and became a job description. She genuinely held both halves. On land, she controlled castles, most notably Rockfleet, and commanded the loyalty of men across her territory. At sea, she ran a fleet that dominated the western waters. Very few people in any age hold real power in two such different domains at once. Grace held both, simultaneously, and made them reinforce each other, the castles sheltering the ships defending the castles. The detail about appearing from a fog bank captures the particular flavour of her sea power. This was not a distant ceremonial authority. It was immediate and frightening. The knowledge that Grace's galleys could materialise out of the mist and the maze of islands, with almost no warning, do their work, and disappear again before anyone organised a response. For a merchant captain crossing those waters, that possibility hung over every voyage like weather. You did not know if this was the day the fog would open and reveal the low dark shapes of the O'Malley fleet, but you knew it could be, and you priced that fear into every decision. What is genuinely singular about her reputation is its source. Powerful women certainly existed in the 16th century, but their power was almost always borrowed, flowing from a father, a husband, a son, a royal bloodline. Their names mattered because of the men attached to them. Grace's name mattered because of Grace. Her reputation rested on her own deeds, her own fleet, her own decisions, her own nerve. She was famous for what she personally did, not for whom she had married, and in her era that made her almost a category of one. You can measure real power by how other people rearrange their lives around it, and by that measure, Grace was enormously powerful. Merchants literally changed their sailing routes to account for her, a whole shipping industry quietly bending its behaviour around one woman's fleet. Rival chieftains factored her into their schemes, unable to plan the region's endless power struggles without asking what Grace would do. She'd become a fixed feature of the landscape, a force that everyone from traders to warlords had to consult before making a move. That is not fame, that is influence. And then there is the ominous final note, the much larger power beginning to take notice from across the sea. Grace had made herself the undisputed queen of her patch of the Atlantic, respected, resented, and feared throughout the west of Ireland. But the very success that made her so formidable locally was also making her visible to something far bigger, an English crown steadily tightening its grip on Ireland, and increasingly aware that a certain seafaring woman was running an independent operation right in the middle of the territory it meant to control. Grace was at the height of her power, which is of course exactly the moment the ground begins to shift. Grace lived at the exact hinge of history when the old Gaelic Ireland she'd grown up in began to give way under the steady pressure of English rule. For centuries, clans like the O'Malleys had governed themselves by their own laws, their own customs, and their own robust enthusiasm for feuding, largely ignoring whatever the distant crown claimed on paper. But the Tudor monarchs wanted Ireland genuinely under control, and they sent administrators, soldiers, and land agreements westward to make it happen. The comfortable chaos Grace had thrived in, all those toll booths and galleys and flexible arrangements, was exactly the sort of thing the new order intended to stamp out. It was less an invasion than a slow tightening, like a belt on a notch you did not agree to. Grace, ever adaptable, would spend the rest of her life dancing along that shifting line between the vanishing world she came from and the harsh new one closing in around her. For centuries the reality of Ireland had been a patchwork of independent clans, each running its own affairs by its own rules. The Gaelic lords made war and peace among themselves, followed their own ancient customs, and treated the English claim to rule Ireland as a technicality that lived on parchment somewhere far away and rarely troubled daily life. It was messy, violent, and chaotic, but it was theirs, and within that chaos a woman like Grace could carve out an empire of water because there was no central authority organised enough to stop her. The Tudors decided to change that, and they meant it. This was the age of Henry VIII and then Elizabeth I, monarchs who wanted Ireland not as a vague theoretical possession, but as a genuinely governed part of their realm. So they began pushing westward with the tools of real control: administrators to run things, soldiers to enforce things, and land agreements to redraw who owned what and under whose authority. The distant claim on parchment started growing teeth and marching inland, one appointment and one garrison at a time. The deadliest part, from Grace's perspective, was that the new order was aimed precisely at everything she was. Her whole way of life depended on the absence of strong central control. Her toll booth on the sea, her flexible arrangements, her ability to operate as an independent power, all of it existed because no larger authority was present to forbid it. The English project was, in essence, a plan to install exactly the kind of authority that would forbid it. They were not targeting Grace personally, at least not at first. They were targeting the entire freewheeling world that made a Grace possible, and she happened to be its most successful product. And the slow nature of the thing made it especially insidious. This was not a single dramatic invasion that a fleet could resist and defeat in an afternoon. It was a gradual tightening, a steady accumulation of officials and rules and pressures, each one small enough to seem manageable, all of them together adding up to strangulation. The belt on the notch you did not agree to is exactly right. No single day felt like the end of the old world. But the direction was relentless, and the outcome was not in doubt, and anyone paying attention could feel the space to breathe slowly closing. Grace's response, characteristically, was not to break herself against the tide in doomed defiance, but to dance along the shifting line. She would spend her remaining decades doing exactly this: adapting, negotiating, bending, occasionally fighting, forever trying to preserve as much of her old freedom as the new reality would allow. She belonged to the vanishing world, but she was too clever to simply vanish with it. Instead, she would spend the rest of her life as a kind of survivor between two ages, one foot in the free Gaelic past that had made her, one foot in the controlled Tudor future that was coming whether she liked it or not, trying to keep her balance as the ground itself moved beneath her. Grace was a pragmatist before she was a rebel, and in the mid-1570s she demonstrated it by sitting down with the English Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir Henry Sidney, and effectively offering him a deal. By Sidney's own account, she came to him and proposed her services, presenting herself with her fleet and her fighting men as a force that could be useful to the crown. Sidney was, by his own admission, impressed, describing her as a most famous and notable captain, which is quite a compliment coming from a man whose job was to pacify people exactly like her. This was classic Grace. She did not romantically fling herself at hopeless resistance. She read the room, saw which way the wind was blowing, and looked for an arrangement that let her keep her ships, her power, and her head. For a while, that flexibility worked. Then the wrong man arrived to govern the west of Ireland, and flexibility ran out. The instinct to negotiate rather than fight to the death is worth dwelling on, because it separates Grace from the doomed romantic rebels that history loves to mourn. Plenty of Gaelic lords chose to resist the English tide head-on, planted their feet, and were destroyed for it, winning songs and losing everything else. Grace looked at that option, and being clear-eyed, declined it. She understood that the crown was bigger, richer, and more persistent than any single fleet, and that throwing herself against it purely for principle was a fast route to a grave. So she reached instead for the negotiating table, and her opening offer was shrewd. She did not go to Sidney as a supplicant begging for mercy, which would have put her in a weak position. She went as a captain proposing a partnership, presenting her fleet and her fighting men as an asset the crown could use. It was a clever reframing of her entire situation. Instead of being a problem to be crushed, she offered to be a resource to be employed. The very ships and men that made her a threat she repackaged as a service. It is the move of someone who understands that the best way to survive a stronger power is to make yourself more valuable alive and cooperative than dead and defiant. The compliment Sidney paid her is genuinely striking when you consider the source. Here was a senior English official whose entire job was to bring unruly Ireland under control, describing Grace as a most famous and notable captain. That is not how you talk about a common pirate you intend to hang. That is how you talk about a formidable operator you respect, perhaps even one you would rather have on your side. Grace had walked into the office of a man whose role was to pacify people like her, and left him impressed. The fact that this description survives in the record at all tells you the impression was real. For a time, this flexibility paid off exactly as intended. By showing herself willing to deal, by making herself useful rather than merely dangerous, Grace bought space to continue operating. She kept her ships, kept her power, kept her head firmly attached to her shoulders, all of which were live questions for an independent Gaelic operator in this era. Adaptation, not defiance, kept her afloat. She had found the narrow path along which a person from the old world could survive into the new one by bending enough to avoid breaking. But the passage carries a warning in its final turn, and it points toward the darkest chapter of Grace's life. The strategy of flexibility only works if there is someone on the other side willing to be flexible back. It depends on dealing with reasonable people who can be reasoned with, officials who will take a good offer and honour a workable arrangement. That happy condition would not last. A different kind of Englishman was coming to govern the west of Ireland, a man immune to charm, uninterested in deals, and set on crushing rather than negotiating. When he arrived, Grace's great gift for finding an arrangement would meet an enemy who refused to offer one, and everything she'd preserved through cleverness would suddenly be at risk. Every good story needs a villain, and Grace's arrived in the form of Sir Richard Bingham, appointed governor of the province of Connaught in the 1580s. Bingham was efficient, ruthless, and entirely unmoved by charm, legend, or the idea that a woman might be a legitimate power in her own right. Where earlier officials had been willing to strike bargains, Bingham intended to break the independent Gaelic lords once and for all, and he pursued the goal with a cold thoroughness that made him loathed across the region. To Bingham, Grace was not a famous and notable captain. She was a lawless old pirate who needed to be crushed like everyone else, and he set about it with grim enthusiasm. For the first time in her long, adaptable life, Grace was up against an enemy who could not be outsailed, outmarried, or outnegotiated. She had finally met a man as stubborn as she was, and he held the power of the crown. Bingham represented a new and far more dangerous kind of English official. The earlier administrators Grace had dealt with, men like Sidney, were pragmatists of a sort, open to arrangements, capable of being impressed, willing to find a workable middle ground with a formidable local power. Bingham was cut from harder cloth. He was efficient and ruthless in equal measure, a man who did his job of subjugation with a cold professionalism that left no room for the flexible accommodations Grace had relied on her whole life. He didn't want to manage the Gaelic lords, he wanted to break them. The quality that made him so lethal to Grace specifically was his immunity to everything that had always worked for her. Charm slid off him. Legend meant nothing to him. The reputation that made rivals wary and officials respectful, Bingham simply disregarded. And crucially, the idea that a woman might be a genuine power in her own right, a notion Grace had spent a lifetime forcing the world to accept, struck Bingham as absurd, even offensive. Every tool in Grace's kit, every lever she had ever pulled, met in Bingham a surface with nothing to grip. He was the one lock her particular set of keys could not open. His broader project made a collision inevitable. Bingham had come to Connaught to finish the job the Crown had been slowly pursuing for decades, to end the independence of the Gaelic lords permanently and bring the whole province firmly to heel. He pursued this with a thoroughness so cold that he became hated across the region, a name spoken with fear and loathing by the very people he governed. In a world of independent powers, he was the great leveller, and Grace, as one of the most independent powers of all, was squarely in his path. There was no version of Bingham's mission that left room for someone like her. The reframing of Grace tells the whole story of the clash. To Sidney, she had been a most famous and notable captain, a description dripping with grudging respect. To Bingham, she was simply a lawless old pirate, a criminal, and a nuisance to be swept away like any other obstacle. The same woman, viewed through two different sets of eyes, and the difference in those eyes would shape the rest of her life. One man saw a power to be reckoned with. The other saw only vermin to be exterminated, and he brought grim enthusiasm to the task. This was the moment Grace's luck, and more importantly her method, finally ran into a wall. Her entire survival strategy had rested on adaptability, on the assumption that any situation could be negotiated, outmanoeuvred, or escaped by a clever enough operator. Bingham was the situation that could not. He could not be outsailed, because his power was administrative, not naval. He could not be outmarried, because he wanted her destroyed, not allied. He could not be outnegotiated, because he refused to negotiate. For the first time, Grace faced an enemy as stubborn as herself, backed by the full weight of the crown, and all her legendary flexibility met something that simply would not bend. The dance along the shifting line was about to become a fight for survival. Under Bingham, the walls closed in. He seized Grace's cattle and lands, cutting at the very foundations of her wealth, and he moved against her family with a brutality that turned political rivalry into something far more personal. The cruelest blow was the death of her eldest son Owen, who according to accounts of the period was taken and killed, while effectively in the hands of Bingham's men, a killing that looked less like justice and more like murder dressed in official clothing. For a woman who had survived storms, sieges, and decades of dangerous men, this was a wound of a different kind. Bingham was not merely taxing her or restricting her. He was dismantling her life piece by piece and reaching for her children. And in doing so, he made a strategic error that history would remember, because he pushed Grace O'Malley into a corner, and Grace in a corner was always at her most dangerous. Bingham's campaign against Grace was methodical, and it started with the economics. He seized her cattle and lands, and while that may sound minor next to the later horrors, it struck at the root of everything. In that world, cattle and land were wealth itself, the foundation on which power stood. Strip those away and you begin to hollow out a person's ability to feed followers, maintain ships, and command loyalty. Bingham was not just harassing Grace. He was systematically demolishing the material base of her power, brick by brick, knowing that a leader without resources eventually becomes a leader without followers. But the seizures were merely the beginning, and Bingham did not stop at property. He moved against her family, and here the conflict curdled from cold political calculation into something searingly personal. There is a difference between an official enforcing the Crown's authority and a man reaching for your children, and Bingham crossed that line. The struggle stopped being about tolls and territory and independence, the ordinary currency of Grace's long career, and became a matter of blood. Whatever detachment Grace had brought to her decades of pragmatic dealing, this was designed to shatter it. The death of Owen was the wound that went deepest. Grace's eldest son was taken and killed while effectively in the custody of Bingham's men, and the accounts make it sound far less like any process of justice than like plain murder wearing the costume of law. To lose a child is the oldest and worst grief there is. To lose one in that way, killed by the men of the governor who was already tearing your life apart and dressed up afterward as something official and legitimate, adds a particular cruelty. It was not just a death. It was a death made to look lawful by the very power responsible for it. We should pause on what this meant for Grace as a human being, not just as a historical figure. She was a woman who had faced down storms that killed other sailors, held castles under siege, commanded crews of dangerous men, and stared at physical death many times without flinching. She was, by any measure, one of the toughest people of her age. But there is a category of pain that toughness does not touch, and the killing of a child lives there. This was a wound of a different kind entirely, one that all her hardness could neither prevent nor heal. And here Bingham, for all his cold efficiency, made the great miscalculation of his career, one that history would remember. He had cornered Grace completely, stripped her wealth, attacked her family, killed her son, and perhaps he assumed that this thoroughness would finish her, that a woman so comprehensively broken would simply collapse into grief and defeat. But he had misread her entirely. Everything in Grace's long life said that when she was pushed into a corner she did not fold. She got dangerous. Bingham had taken almost everything from her, and in doing so he had removed her reasons for caution and left her with nothing to lose. A cornered Grace was the most dangerous Grace of all, and she was about to prove it in a way no one could have predicted. Bingham escalated further, taking as prisoners Grace's son Tiburton Long and her half-brother, holding them as leverage and as a signal that the O'Malley power was finished. Grace now faced the nightmare that had haunted her since the tightening began. Her fleet could not sail its way out of a prison cell. Her galleys, so unstoppable on the open water, were useless against paperwork, dungeons, and a governor who answered to no one nearby. Everything she had built over a lifetime, the ships, the tolls, the loyal crews, the hard-won independence, could not free her own family from the Crown's grip. Most people at this point, well into their 60s by the standards of the era, would have accepted defeat as inevitable and grieved quietly. Grace instead did the single most audacious thing available to her. She decided to go over Bingham's head. All the way over, straight to the top. The taking of Tiburton Long and her half-brother was a calculated move, not a fit of cruelty. By seizing these men as prisoners, Bingham accomplished two things at once. He acquired leverage, hostages whose safety he could hold over Grace to force her compliance, and he sent a message to the entire region that the mighty O'Malley power was broken, its leader unable even to protect her own kin. It was a public humiliation as much as a private threat, designed to demonstrate that Grace's day was done and the Crown's writ now ran even into the heart of her family. The horror of it, for Grace, was precisely that it neutralized everything she was good at. Consider the shape of her whole life. Every problem she'd ever faced she had solved with ships, with the sea, with the fast galleys and hard men that made her formidable. Storms, sieges, rival warlords, greedy merchants, even earlier English officials, all of it had been navigable with maritime power and clever manoeuvring, but a prison cell floats on no water. Her fleet, the answer to every previous question, was simply the wrong tool for this one. You cannot sail a galley into a dungeon. That is the cruel logic the passage lays bare. The Crown had found the one form of attack against which Grace's entire arsenal was useless. Her power was naval, immediate, physical, the power to appear from a fog bank and take what she wanted on the open sea. Bingham's power was administrative and bureaucratic, expressed through paperwork, imprisonment, and the slow machinery of a state. These two kinds of power did not even occupy the same battlefield. Grace could dominate the water utterly, and it would not spring a single prisoner from a cell. Everything she had built collided with a wall it could not touch, and so she stood, in her 60s, facing what looked like total defeat. Her wealth was seized, her eldest son was dead, and now her other son and her half-brother sat in the Crown's prisons, held as tokens of her ruin. The lifetime of ships and tolls and loyal crews and stubbornly defended independence had all led to this, an old woman unable to free her own family. The passage is honest about what most people would have done here. They would have accepted it. Well into old age, comprehensively beaten, having lost so much already, most people would have grieved quietly and let the darkness close. Defeat was the reasonable expectation. Grace was not most people, and she never had been. Faced with a wall her fleet could not breach, she did not batter herself against it or sink into resignation. She thought her way around it. If Bingham was the immovable problem, then the answer was not to fight Bingham at all, but to go above him, to appeal to the only authority that outranked him. She decided to go over the governor's head, all the way to the top, to the one person in the world who could overrule him. It was breathtaking in its audacity, the sort of move that should have been impossible for a person in her position. But Grace had spent her whole life doing the impossible by simply refusing to accept the limits everyone else took for granted, and she was not about to stop now, not with her family in chains. She was going to take her complaint to the Queen of England herself. If the local governor was the problem, Grace reasoned, then she would simply appeal to the only authority above him, which happened to be the Queen of England herself. In the year 1593, Grace composed a petition to Elizabeth I, laying out her grievances, requesting the release of her captured son and brother, and asking with a straight face for the means to support herself in her old age, given that the Crown's own governor had stripped her of nearly everything. The sheer nerve of this is difficult to overstate. Here was an Irish pirate, an outlaw by English reckoning, formally writing to the most powerful monarch in Europe to complain about that monarch's own official. It was the equivalent of being audited by a tax office and responding by requesting a private meeting with the head of the entire government to discuss the auditor's attitude. And astonishingly, it worked well enough to earn her an invitation. The logic behind the move was cold and correct, the reasoning of someone who had spent a lifetime finding the one path through impossible waters. Bingham could not be beaten on his own level, so Grace refused to fight on his level at all. Every hierarchy has a top, and the top can overrule everyone below it. If the governor was the wall, then the person who could give the governor orders was the door. There was exactly one such person, Elizabeth I, and so Grace, with the clarity of a strategist who has run out of other options, aimed her entire remaining strength at the very summit of the system that was crushing her. The petition itself was a small masterpiece of framing, and it is worth appreciating how carefully it was pitched. Grace did not write as a defeated criminal begging for scraps. She laid out grievances, made specific requests, the release of her son and brother chief among them, and asked for the means to support herself in her old age. That last request is a stroke of genius. By presenting herself as an elderly woman left destitute by the Crown's own governor, she reframed the entire affair. She was no longer a pirate to be punished, but a poor old subject wronged by an overzealous official, appealing to the fairness of a great queen. It was a story designed to make Elizabeth the reasonable party and Bingham the problem. But no amount of clever framing can disguise the raw, staggering audacity of the act. and the passage is right to insist we not let it slide past. Grace was, by every English legal definition, an outlaw, a pirate, a lifelong thorn in the Crown's side, a woman who had spent decades running an independent operation in defiance of English authority. And this person sat down and formally wrote to the most powerful monarch in Europe not to surrender, not to plead for her life, but to complain about the behaviour of that monarch's own appointed governor. The gap between her official status and her chosen action is almost comic in its size. The modern comparison lands the point squarely. Imagine being audited by the tax office, a routine act of a powerful institution against a small individual, and responding not with compliance or quiet dread, but by demanding a private meeting with the head of the entire government to discuss your auditor's attitude. It is the sort of thing people fantasize about doing and never dare. Most of us, faced with a large hostile bureaucracy, keep our heads down and hope to survive it. Grace looked at the largest, most hostile bureaucracy of her world and decided the right move was to escalate to its absolute peak. And the truly remarkable part, the thing that turns audacity into legend, is that it worked, at least well enough to open the door. The petition did not vanish into a pile or earn Grace a swift arrest for her impertinence. It reached the right level, it did its job, and it earned her something almost no Gaelic outlaw could ever have dreamed of. An invitation. Elizabeth was willing to see her. The old pirate queen's impossible gambit, the decision to go straight to the top, had cracked open the door to the throne room of England itself, and Grace, of course, intended to walk through it. Not content to let letters do the work, Grace made the extraordinary decision to sail to England and press her case in person. This was a woman in her 60s, in an age when reaching your 60s was itself a considerable achievement, undertaking a long and dangerous sea voyage into the heart of the empire that had spent years dismantling her life, in order to walk into its most famous court and argue. She could have been arrested on arrival. She could have been ignored. She could have simply drowned along the way, which the Atlantic was always happy to arrange. Grace went anyway, guiding herself to the very lion's den and requesting an audience with the lion. It was the ultimate expression of everything she had ever been. When the situation looked impossible, Grace did not shrink from it. She sailed directly at it and knocked on the door. The decision to go in person rather than let the petition and its official reply travel back and forth tells you Grace understood something about power that never changes. A letter is easy to ignore, delay, or bury. A person standing in the room is not. She could have waited safely in Ireland for the machinery to grind out some response. But Grace knew that presence carries a weight paper never can. So she chose to put her actual body, aged and weathered as it was, directly in front of the people who held her family's fate, forcing them to reckon with her as a living human being rather than a name on a document. And the physical reality of that choice was genuinely dangerous, on several fronts at once. First, there was her age. Grace was in her 60s, and in a century where reaching 60 at all was an accomplishment most people didn't manage, she was undertaking something that would tax a person half her years. A long sea voyage was not a comfortable cruise. It was days of exposure, hardship, and physical strain, the kind of ordeal that could break an old body outright before she even arrived to face the far greater dangers waiting on shore. Then there was the destination itself, which is where the courage becomes almost dizzying. Grace was sailing into the heart of the very empire that had spent years methodically destroying her, seizing her wealth, killing her eldest son, imprisoning her family. This was not a neutral errand. She was placing herself willingly inside the reach of her enemies, walking into the lion's den, and then politely asking to speak with the lion. The people who had done her the greatest harm of her life were the people she was choosing to visit in their own capital, on their own ground, where every advantage was theirs. The passage is honest about the ways it could all have gone wrong, and the list is sobering. She could have been arrested the moment she landed, an outlaw delivering herself conveniently to English authorities. She could have been ignored, the invitation quietly withdrawn or endlessly delayed until she gave up. Or she could simply have drowned somewhere in the crossing, the Atlantic being an ocean that had never needed an excuse to kill sailors and would have felt no special reluctance about this one. Any of these outcomes was entirely plausible. Grace weighed them, presumably, and went anyway. This is why the voyage stands as the purest distillation of who Grace O'Malley was. Her entire life had been a series of moments where the reasonable, safe, expected response was to shrink, to accept limits, to bow to the larger force, and her entire life had been a series of refusals to do so. The girl who cut her hair, the widow who built a fleet, the captain who ruled the sea, the mother who fought a day after childbirth, all of it pointed to this. Faced with an impossible situation, Grace did not retreat and she did not despair. She sailed directly at the impossible thing, crossed a deadly ocean into the arms of her enemies, and knocked on the door of the most powerful court on earth. And then she waited to see if the lion would answer. The meeting took place at the Royal Palace at Greenwich, and it remains one of the great scenes of the age. Two remarkable women, born roughly the same distance apart in years as in worlds, facing each other across a room. On one side stood Elizabeth I, Queen of England, draped in the wealth and ceremony of a global power. On the other stood Grace O'Malley, weathered by decades at sea, representing a way of life the Queen's own government was actively erasing. They had almost nothing in common except the two most important things. Both were women who had seized and held real power in a world designed entirely for men, and neither had any intention of being talked down to. By tradition, the two conversed in Latin, since Grace reportedly spoke no English, and Elizabeth certainly spoke no Irish, which means the summit of Grace's entire career was conducted in a dead language by two people who each refused, on principle, to blink first. Set the scene properly, because the contrast is the whole point. Greenwich Palace was a stage built to overwhelm, a place designed to remind every visitor of the Crown's wealth and reach. Into this gilded setting walked Grace, an old woman shaped by a lifetime of salt and storms, her whole bearing belonging to the wild Atlantic coast rather than to any court. The two women who met there could hardly have come from more different worlds. One had been raised at the centre of power and ceremony, the other had cut her hair off to sneak onto a boat. And yet here they were, in the same room, as something close to equals. Because for all their differences, Elizabeth and Grace shared the two things that mattered more than any of the rest. Both were women who had taken real power, not borrowed or ornamental power, but the genuine article, and held on to it in a world constructed from top to bottom to deny it to them. Elizabeth ruled a kingdom that had never wanted a queen regnant, and had spent her reign proving she could do the job better than the men who doubted her. Grace ruled a fleet and a coastline that no one had ever intended a woman to command. Different in almost every particular, they were nonetheless members of the same tiny and improbable club. The second thing they shared was temperament, and it charges the whole encounter with quiet tension. Neither woman had the slightest intention of being talked down to. Elizabeth was not going to be lectured by an Irish pirate, and Grace, extraordinarily, was not going to grovel before an English queen. This was not a supplicant crawling before a monarch. It was, in its strange way, a summit between two sovereigns, each of whom had spent a lifetime refusing to yield, now taking the measure of the only other person in the room who could possibly understand what that had cost. The detail about Latin is the perfect emblem of the whole meeting. Grace spoke no English, and Elizabeth certainly spoke no Irish, so the two of them communicated in Latin, the shared scholarly tongue of educated Europe. Think about what that reveals. Grace, the supposed lawless old pirate, was learned enough to hold a conversation with the Queen of England in Latin. This was no ignorant brigand, but a sophisticated, cultured woman, capable of meeting a monarch on intellectual ground. The image of these two conversing in a dead language, each too proud to give an inch, is almost too perfect. A battle of wills conducted in the vocabulary of ancient Rome. And that image, two aging queens facing off in Latin at Greenwich, neither willing to blink first, is the summit of Grace's entire life, the peak toward which every earlier chapter had been climbing. The girl on the boat, the widow with the fleet, the captain of the fog bank, the mother on the deck, the petitioner who dared write to a queen, all of it had led here, to a room where Grace O'Malley stood before the most powerful monarch in Europe and treated her not as a terrified subject, but as a counterpart. Whatever the meeting produced, the mere fact of it was a triumph. Grace had made the Queen of England sit down and talk with her, as one formidable woman to another, and the world would remember that they had. The meeting attracted so many legends that separating fact from folklore is nearly hopeless, but the stories are far too good to leave out. It is said that Grace refused to bow to Elizabeth on the grounds that she didn't recognise the English Queen as the Queen of Ireland, and considered herself a ruler in her own right rather than a subject. Another tale claims the guards discovered a dagger concealed on Grace, and when confronted she calmly explained she carried it for her own safety, which the court found alarming and Grace found perfectly reasonable. The most charming legend has Grace sneezing and being handed a fine lace handkerchief, which she used and then tossed straight into the fireplace, baffling the English courtiers, who kept such things for reuse. When they objected, Grace reportedly implied the Irish had higher standards of hygiene, which is a magnificent thing to say to a room full of your captors. True or not, every one of these stories points the same direction. Grace refused to be small. Take the refusal to bow first, because it is the boldest of the three, and the one that best captures her position. In the choreography of a royal audience, the bow was not optional. You bowed because the monarch was your sovereign and you were the subject, and the gesture said so with the whole body. Grace, according to legend, declined. Her reasoning was pure Gaelic pride. She didn't recognise Elizabeth as the Queen of Ireland, and she considered herself a ruler in her own right, not a subject at all. To bow would have been to concede the entire argument of her life, so she stayed upright, greeting one monarch as another rather than as a servant. The dagger story adds a note of dark comedy while making the same point. As Grace was searched before meeting the Queen, the guards found a blade concealed on her person, which in the paranoid atmosphere of a royal court was roughly as welcome as a lit torch in a hay barn. Confronted about it, Grace did not panic or apologise. She calmly explained that she carried it for her own safety, as any sensible person would. The court found this deeply alarming. Grace found their alarm faintly ridiculous. To her, a weapon was simply a normal part of being alive in a dangerous world. The gap between the courtier's horror and her own matter-of-factness is the whole joke. But the handkerchief is the jewel of the collection, the story everyone remembers, and it deserves its fame. Grace sneezes. A courtier, all refinement, offers her a fine lace handkerchief. Grace uses it, and then, to the silent horror of the room, throws it directly into the fire. When the scandalised courtiers explain that one keeps such a handkerchief, tucks it away, and uses it again, Grace reportedly expresses astonishment that anyone would carry around a used handkerchief, implying that the Irish, whatever the English thought of them, would never dream of doing something so filthy. In a single gesture she had turned the tables completely, casting her sophisticated hosts as the unhygienic ones, and herself as the person with standards. That reversal is why the handkerchief story has survived so joyfully. The English court regarded the Irish as rough, backward, half-civilized, and here was Grace, in the heart of that court, calmly implying the reverse, that it was the refined English who were the disgusting ones for reusing a soiled cloth. It is a perfect piece of defiance, delivered not with a weapon, but with a raised eyebrow and an impeccable sense of comic timing. She took the entire framework of English superiority and flipped it inside out over something as small as a sneeze. Whether any of these three stories happened exactly as told is genuinely doubtful, and honesty requires admitting the legends have almost certainly outgrown the facts, but they all point in precisely the same direction, and that shared direction is itself a kind of truth. Every single tale, whatever its factual footing, insists on the same thing about Grace. She refused to be small, facing the most powerful woman in Europe in the heart of the empire that had gutted her life. Surrounded by people who could have destroyed her, Grace declined to shrink, to grovel, to be less than she was. The details may be folklore, the character is history. And the character stood tall in a room built to make people kneel. Beneath the legends, a real negotiation took place, and Grace came away with something concrete. Elizabeth, evidently taking the measure of the formidable woman in front of her, agreed to intervene. She sent instructions to Bingham to release Grace's captured son and brother, and to allow Grace the means to live out her days, effectively overruling her own governor in favour of the pirate. On the surface, it was a stunning victory. Grace had sailed into the belly of the empire, argued her case to its ruler, and walked out with a royal order in her favour. Two women who by every rule of their time should have been enemies had found in each other a strange flicker of mutual recognition. For a shining moment it looked as though Grace had done the impossible, beaten the system from the inside and secured a peaceful, dignified old age. And then the order had to travel back to Ireland, where Bingham was waiting. Strip away the handkerchiefs and daggers, and underneath sits a genuine diplomatic outcome, which is in some ways more impressive than the folklore. A real negotiation occurred between two heads of power, and Grace did not leave empty-handed. Elizabeth, having sized up the remarkable person standing before her, decided to act on her behalf. This was not vague sympathy or a polite brush-off. The Queen agreed to intervene directly in the affair, to reach down into the machinery of her Irish administration and change its course in Grace's favour. Whatever passed between the two women in that room, it was enough to move a monarch to action. The specific terms were exactly what Grace had crossed an ocean to secure. Elizabeth sent instructions to Bingham to release the captured son and brother, striking at the very heart of Grace's grief and her purpose in coming. And she directed that Grace be allowed the means to live out her days, addressing that shrewd request from the petition, the plea of an old woman left destitute by the Crown's own servant. On paper, Grace had won everything she came for. Her family would be freed, and her old age would be secured, both by direct command of the Queen of England. The most extraordinary feature of the outcome is what it meant institutionally. Elizabeth was effectively overruling her own governor in favour of a pirate. Bingham was the Crown's man in the west of Ireland, appointed to impose order, and Grace was, by his reckoning, and the laws, an outlaw. For the monarch to side with the outlaw against her own official was a remarkable thing, a testament to the impression Grace had made in person. She had not merely won sympathy, she had won a decision, and the decision went against the very representative of English power who had spent years destroying her. Step back and the scale of the achievement is almost hard to believe. Grace had sailed into the belly of the empire that had ruined her, argued her case face to face with its ruler, and walked out with a royal order in her own favour. She had beaten the system, not by fighting it with ships, which was impossible, but by climbing over it to the very top and persuading the summit to rule for her. Two women who by every rule of their world should have been bitter enemies, the English Queen and the Irish pirate, had instead found in one another a strange flicker of recognition. Two survivors of an impossible game acknowledging each other across the divide. For one shining moment then, it looked like the perfect ending, the impossible triumph, the peaceful and dignified old age won through sheer nerve and cleverness. Grace had done what no one in her position should have been able to do, but the passage ends on a quiet, ominous note, and it is the note that governs everything to come. A royal order is only words until someone carries it out, and this particular order now had to travel all the way back to Ireland, into the hands of the one man in the world least inclined to honour it. Bingham was waiting, and the promise made in the warmth of Greenwich would have to survive contact with the cold reality of Connaught. The trouble with a royal promise made hundreds of miles from the man expected to carry it out is that men like Bingham are experts at the slow, deliberate art of not quite complying. When the Queen's instructions reached Connaught, Bingham dragged his feet, obstructed where he could, and interpreted the orders as narrowly as possible, ensuring that Grace's grand victory in London curdled into frustration back home. Some concessions were honoured, others quietly strangled in bureaucracy, and Grace discovered the timeless lesson that winning at the top means very little when the person at the bottom controls the paperwork. It was a bitter education for a woman used to enforcing her own will directly. She'd outmanoeuvred the empire in its own throne room, only to be worn down by a mid-level official's talent for delay. The conflict between Grace and Bingham ground on, and while Bingham himself eventually fell from favour, the world Grace had fought for kept shrinking around her. The problem Grace ran into is one that has frustrated powerful people in every century: the vast gap between issuing a command and having it actually happen. Elizabeth's order was real and genuine, but Elizabeth was in England and Bingham was in Ireland on the ground, in control of the actual execution. And Bingham belonged to that maddening breed of official who has perfected the art of not quite disobeying while never quite complying. He did not openly defy his queen, which would have been dangerous. He simply dragged his feet, raised difficulties, and honoured the letter of the order while gutting its spirit, a form of resistance almost impossible to punish because it never announces itself. Watch the specific techniques, because they are the eternal tools of the reluctant subordinate. He interpreted the orders as narrowly as he possibly could, granting the barest minimum the words could be made to require. Some concessions he honoured, presumably the ones too visible to avoid, while others he quietly strangled in bureaucracy, letting them die slow procedural deaths in the machinery of delay. There was always a reason the fuller compliance could not happen just yet, always another obstacle, always more time needed. Grace's clear, hard-won victory dissolved into a fog of technicalities, each one small and deniable, all of them together adding up to defeat. And so Grace learned a lesson as bitter as it is timeless. Winning at the top means very little when the person at the bottom controls the paperwork. She'd achieved the seemingly greater thing, a favourable ruling from the monarch herself, only to be defeated by the lesser one, a provincial governor's mastery of delay. The grand triumph in the throne room turned out to be worth only as much as the local official chose to let it be worth, and that official chose to let it be worth as little as he could manage. Power, she discovered, does not always flow downhill as cleanly as the diagram suggests. For Grace in particular, this was a peculiarly galling defeat, because it was so alien to how she had operated all her life. Grace was a woman of direct action. When she wanted something, she took a ship and made it happen, immediately, physically, on her own authority. Her entire career had been built on enforcing her own will through her own strength. Now she found herself trapped in a slow war of memos and interpretations and bureaucratic foot-dragging, a battlefield where her galleys were useless, and her enemy was armed with nothing but the ability to say not yet indefinitely. It was the wrong kind of fight for the right kind of warrior. The passage closes on a note of grinding gradual loss rather than dramatic defeat, which is somehow sadder. The conflict did not end in a great final battle. It simply ground on. Bingham himself eventually fell from favour, so Grace outlasted her nemesis in that narrow sense, but the deeper defeat was structural and unstoppable. The world she'd fought for, the free, independent Gaelic world of her youth and her prime, kept shrinking around her regardless of any single victory or the fall of any single man. She had beaten the Empire in a room in Greenwich, and it had not been enough, because the tide she was fighting was larger than Bingham, larger than Elizabeth, larger than any one order or argument. It was the tide of history itself, and even Grace could not sail against that forever. What is genuinely remarkable is that even in her final years, worn by loss and hemmed in by a changing world, Grace did not simply retire to a chair by the fire. Deep into her 60s, an age when most of her contemporaries were long dead, she was reportedly still active on the water, still involved in the endless manoeuvring between the Gaelic lords and the crown, still refusing to become a quiet old woman in the corner of history. The sea had been her element since she was a girl with a fresh haircut and a stolen place on her father's ship, and she stayed loyal to it to the end. There is something both defiant and a little heartbreaking in the image. The old queen of the Atlantic, her fleet diminished, her sons scattered, her enemies triumphant, still turning her face to the wind and refusing to admit that her age was ending, even as the tide of history quietly carried it away. Start with the plain arithmetic of her age, because it reframes everything. Grace was deep into her 60s in an era when reaching such an age was rare enough to be almost freakish. Most of the people she had grown up with, sailed with, fought with, and loved were long dead. Disease, violence, childbirth, hard labour, and simple hunger had thinned out her entire generation. She was, by the standards of her world, ancient, a survivor who had outlasted nearly everyone. And a survivor of that vintage was expected to withdraw, to rest, to become at most a source of old stories by the fire. Grace declined the fire. The reports have her still active on the water in these final years, still doing the things she had done her whole life, still reading the sea and riding it despite a body that must have felt every one of its decades. And she remained tangled in the great game as well, the endless three-way manoeuvring among the Gaelic lords, their rivals, and the crown that was slowly swallowing them all. She had not retired from either of her worlds, the physical world of ships and the political world of power. She was old, but she was not finished, and she seemed to have no intention of ever declaring herself so. The loyalty to the sea gives the picture its emotional depth. The passage reminds us where it all began, with a girl who cut off her hair and stole a place on her father's ship because she could not bear to be left ashore. That girl and this old woman were the same person, bound by the same lifelong devotion to the water. The sea had been Grace's element from the very start, the thing she had fought to reach, the source of her freedom and her power and her identity. And she stayed loyal to it clear to the end, returning to it again and again even when age and loss might have excused her from ever setting sail again. But the passage is careful and honest not to paint this as simple triumph, because it is shaded with something sadder. There is defiance in the image, yes, but there is heartbreak in it too. The Grace of these final years was not the Grace at the height of her powers. Her fleet was diminished, worn down by the crown's long pressure. Her sons were scattered, one dead, others pulled into the new order. Her enemies, whatever the fall of individual men like Bingham, had essentially won the larger war. The free world she embodied was nearly gone, and still she sailed, still she manoeuvred, still she refused to concede. That refusal is the heart of the whole portrait, both magnificent and quietly tragic. Grace was an old woman turning her weathered face into the wind, declining to admit that her age was over, even as the tide of history carried that age away beneath her keel. She could win small battles, outlast particular enemies, keep sailing a while longer. What she could not do was stop time or reverse the vast, slow current pulling her world under. And some part of her surely knew it. Yet she sailed anyway, defiant to the last, the queen of a vanishing sea insisting on her own existence, right up until the water finally closed over the age she belonged to. There are worse ways to grow old than that, and very few braver ones. The story of Grace's youngest son, Tibbot Nalong, the one born at sea, is a fitting and slightly melancholy epilogue to her world. Raised by a mother who spent her life resisting English control, Tibbot came of age in the new island his mother's generation had failed to hold back, and he made the pragmatic choice his mother herself might grudgingly have understood. He aligned himself with the English, fought on the Crown's side in the great conflicts that decided Ireland's fate, and was eventually rewarded, long after Grace was gone, with an English title, becoming a Viscount. The Pirate Queen's boy ended up a lord of the very system she had battled. It was not betrayal so much as survival, the same instinct that had led Grace to negotiate with Lord Deputies and petition queens. But it marked, unmistakably, the closing of a door. The wild, independent world of the O'Malley galleys was passing into the past, and Grace's own son helped carry it there. There is a neat, sorrowful symmetry in the fact that this epilogue belongs to Tibbot, the child born at sea, the one whose very nickname, Theobald of the Ships, tied him to his mother's element from his first breath. Of all Grace's children, he was the most vividly marked as hers, born on a galley in the middle of her working life, defended by a mother who rose from childbirth to fight. If any child should have carried the O'Malley spirit forward unchanged, it was this one. And yet it is precisely this most symbolically maritime of her children, whose life traces the final dissolution of everything the sea had meant to her. Tibbot's choice, though, was not made in a vacuum, and the passage is careful to be fair to him. He came of age in a different Ireland than the one his mother had ruled. The free Gaelic world was already crumbling by the time he was grown, the Crown's control already tightening past the point of realistic resistance. Grace's generation had fought to hold that world together, and had, in the larger sense, failed. Tibbot inherited not his mother's Ireland, but the new one that was replacing it, and he had to make his life inside the reality that actually existed, rather than the one his mother wished had survived. So he made the pragmatic choice, and the passage insists we recognise it as pragmatism rather than treachery. Tibbot aligned himself with the English, fought on the Crown's side in the great conflicts that would decide Ireland's future, and cast his lot with the winning order rather than the dying one. Long after Grace herself was gone, this alignment paid off in the currency of the New World. He was rewarded with an English title, and became a Viscount, a lord of the very system his mother had spent her life defying. The Pirate Queen's sea-born boy ended his days as a member of the English aristocracy. The passage makes a subtle and generous argument about how to read this, and it hinges on a resemblance to Grace herself. This was not betrayal, it suggests, but survival, and survival of a specifically O'Malley kind. Remember that Grace too had negotiated with English Lord Deputies, had offered her services to the Crown, had sailed to England to petition a queen. Grace was never a romantic who chose glorious death over practical compromise. She bent constantly in order not to break. Tibbot simply took that same family instinct one generation further, bending all the way into the new order because that was where survival now lay. His mother, the passage suggests, might grudgingly have understood. And yet, understanding it does not soften what it meant. Tibbott's rise as an English viscount marked unmistakably the closing of a door. The wild, independent, self-ruling world of the O'Malley galleys, the world in which a woman could build an empire of water and answer to no one, was passing into the past, and it was Grace's own son who helped carry it there. There is no villain in this ending, only the quiet, relentless work of time. The mother resisted the new world with everything she had. The son joined it and prospered. Both, in their way, were doing the same thing, trying to survive. But between the two of them, across a single generation, an entire age quietly ended. So there it is. The whole strange, salt-soaked life of the woman the English filed under problem that will not go away, and the Irish remembered as Granuaile. Think back over the day we have sailed through together. A little girl told she could not go to sea, cutting off her own hair to prove a point. A young wife quietly becoming more capable than every man around her. A widow who turned her grief into a fleet. A captain who ruled the fog and the tides. A mother who fought a battle a day after giving birth. An old woman who crossed a deadly ocean to look a queen in the eye and refused, absolutely refused to bow. She lost a great deal along the way. Her wealth was seized, her son was killed, her world was slowly pulled under by a tide no fleet could fight, and still she sailed, still she schemed, still she turned her weathered face into the wind and declined to admit that her age was ending. It is worth remembering as you drift off just how stacked the odds were against a life like hers. She lived in a world that had decided, before she was even born, exactly what a woman was allowed to be, and it was not a captain, not a commander, not a power that queens and governors had to reckon with. Grace was handed a small, quiet role, and simply refused to play it, over and over, for 70 years, until the world gave up arguing and let her be who she already was. She did not wait for permission that was never going to come. She just did the impossible thing so many times that impossible stopped being a useful word. And that is the quiet, stubborn miracle at the heart of it. The thing that outlasted her ships and her castles, and even her name. People are far tougher than the times that try to contain them. The old Gaelic world Grace belonged to vanished beneath the weight of empire, exactly as she must have feared it would. But she is still here, 400 years later, whispered about in the dark by people she could never have imagined, in places she never knew existed. History took her world, it did not take her. So tonight, as you settle deeper into a bed that does not pitch on the waves, in a home no raider will storm before morning, safe and warm and gloriously free to simply rest, maybe spare a quiet thought for Grace O'Malley and all the stubborn, salt-worn souls like her, the ones who refused to be small, the ones who sailed straight at the impossible and knocked on the door. They fought the wind and the tide and the whole weight of their age so that someday, somewhere, someone could lie still in the dark and feel perfectly safe. The sea that carried Grace is still out there, turning over in the night, the same as it ever was. But you do not have to face it. You can let the sound of it, real or imagined, rise and fall and carry you gently out. Rest easy. The tide is going out, the wind has softened, and the harbour for tonight is calm. Sleep well.